A biker poured beer on a girl, thinking it would make everyone laugh, but he had no idea who was sitting next to him. Watch until the end to find out how Ronda Rousey made them regret it. Subscribe and write where you are watching this video from. The rain had been falling without pause for hours, coating the long stretch of highway in a sheen of silver that reflected the dull orange glow of the few working street lamps. Each passing truck sent waves of spray against the sagging building that clung stubbornly to its patch of cracked asphalt. The bar had no sign worth noticing anymore, only a bent piece of tin with faded letters that once proudly spelled a name, now reduced to something illegible beneath rust and years of neglect. Those who drove past knew it by habit, not by name. For some, it was a refuge. For others, a mistake waiting to happen. That night, it was both. Inside, the air was thick and heavy. The faint tang of wet leather from soaked jackets mingled with the ever-present haze of smoke. The jukebox in the corner had been grinding out old rock songs all evening, its speakers buzzing whenever the bass line hit too hard. Each thud of the bass merged with the clatter of pool balls and the heavy laughter that echoed from the center of the room. It was a place where voices seemed too loud for the space, a place where shadows clung to the walls, not because of any mystery, but because the bulbs above were too tired to chase them away. The woman at the bar sat quietly, her hands folded over a half-empty glass of cola that she had ordered hours earlier and sipped with little enthusiasm. She was younger than most who frequented this kind of place, her posture betraying an unease that grew sharper each time laughter erupted from the large table of bikers behind her. Her clothes were simple, a plain blouse, a skirt that had been chosen for comfort rather than show, a light coat still damp from the walk through the rain. Every now and then she would glance at the clock above the bar, as though willing time to move faster so she could be gone. But the storm outside was merciless, and the thought of walking back into it made her hesitate. The bartender, a man with tired eyes and a permanent slump in his shoulders, polished the same glass for the 5th time that hour. He had seen this scene too many times. New faces rarely wandered in, and when they did, the night often turned ugly. He caught himself glancing toward the bikers, watching their movements, noting the way their laughter grew sharper with each round of beer. He said nothing, of course. Speaking out in this place could make you part of the problem, and he had learned long ago that survival meant invisibility. In the far corner, seated alone at a table meant for two, was another woman who had drawn little attention. Her hood rested loosely over her head, casting a shadow across her face. She ate slowly, her meal simple, her movements unhurried. She had the posture of someone who was relaxed yet ready, like a traveler who carried calm within herself no matter where she stopped. Beneath the hood, her eyes were sharp, watching without seeming to watch, measuring every voice and every laugh. Ronda Rousey had been in places like this before, and she knew their rhythm. She knew how men like the ones at the center table worked themselves into a frenzy, how they tested boundaries until someone broke. She also knew that stepping in too soon only gave them reason to escalate. Timing mattered. Control mattered more. The bikers themselves were a spectacle in their own right. 8 of them crowded around a scarred table, their jackets emblazoned with a patch that marked their allegiance to some club that mattered only to them. Their leader, a tall man with a jagged scar running down one cheek, sat with his legs spread wide, his heavy boots planted firmly on the sticky floorboards. His laugh was a rasp that scraped through the room, setting the tone for the others. They mimicked his energy, throwing insults across the table, slamming fists against wood, their voices competing with the jukebox for dominance. Other patrons pretended not to notice. A pair of truckers hunched over their beers at a small table by the door, their shoulders drawn tight, their eyes fixed on the amber liquid in their glasses. A middle-aged couple sat in silence near the jukebox, the woman clutching her purse tightly, the man tapping his foot against the floor in nervous rhythm. Everyone knew how this script played out, and everyone had learned the same lesson. The best way to survive was to keep quiet, to stay still, and to hope the storm passed without picking them as its target. The rain outside tapped harder against the windows, blurring the outlines of the highway. The storm had become a drumbeat, steady and relentless, as though warning that tension inside would soon match its fury. The young woman at the bar shifted uncomfortably, her fingers tightening around her glass. She tried to distract herself by studying the bottles lined neatly behind the counter, their labels dulled by time and dust. But she could feel the weight of eyes on her, glances tossed like stones from the table behind. She didn't dare look back, though she knew what she would see. Smirks, raised eyebrows, the early stages of something that never ended well. Rhonda's gaze flicked toward her only briefly before returning to her plate. She could read the signs as clearly as the bartender could. The bikers were restless. Their fun had grown stale, and they were searching for something new to amuse them. The woman at the bar had become the obvious choice, not because she had done anything, but because she hadn't. Her silence, her attempt to disappear into the room, was exactly the kind of thing men like that couldn't resist disrupting. The leader of the bikers leaned back in his chair, his hand tapping idly against his beer bottle. His eyes narrowed toward the woman at the bar, and the grin that spread across his face was slow, deliberate, the kind of grin that signaled intent rather than humor. His men noticed and followed his gaze. The laughter grew softer, more focused, less like a chorus and more like the sharpening of knives. The woman didn't see it, but Rhonda did. She set down her fork, wiped her mouth with a napkin, and leaned back in her chair. Her breathing was steady, her expression unreadable, but inside she was counting the beats of the night, waiting for the moment when the inevitable line would be crossed. The bartender's hand trembled slightly as he placed a bottle back onto the shelf. He caught the look in the leader's eyes and felt the dread settle deep in his gut. He considered saying something, maybe offering the woman a reason to step outside, but the thought died as quickly as it surfaced. Men like those didn't need excuses. They needed challenges, and he knew that trying to intervene would only paint a target on his own back. So he said nothing, polishing another glass, letting the weight of helplessness settle over him. The room itself seemed to hold its breath as the storm outside roared louder, the rain drumming harder against the roof. The bikers' voices dipped into lower tones, their laughter replaced by the kind of smirks that meant they were planning something. The woman at the bar shifted again, unaware that she had become the center of their attention. And in the corner, Ronda Rousey lowered her hood, her eyes narrowing as she prepared herself. She did not plan to act yet, but she knew she would. The question wasn't if, it was when. That was how the night began, with a storm outside and a quieter one gathering inside. Each drop of rain a reminder that something was building, waiting, ready to break. The rain outside did not relent. It pressed against the windows in a steady rhythm, each drop splashing against glass and tin, reminding those inside that the world beyond the bar was cold, wet, and dark. Inside, though, the air had grown heavier, as though the walls themselves understood what was beginning to stir. The young woman at the bar tried to ignore the way her shoulders tensed, the way her neck prickled when laughter rose from the table behind her. She knew she was being noticed, even if she refused to turn her head and confirm it. Sometimes silence could shield you, but sometimes silence made you the perfect target. The bikers, who had spent the better part of an hour drowning themselves in beer and crude stories, began shifting their attention. Their voices, once scattered in loud jokes and insults thrown back and forth across their table, had started to narrow, sharpen. It was like the sound of a pack of dogs catching a scent. One of them leaned back, his chair creaking under his weight, and tilted his chin toward the bar. Another followed his gaze. It took only seconds for the others to understand what had caught their leader's eye. Their laughter turned pointed, crueler, no longer about each other, but about what they were preparing to do to someone else. The young woman heard the first of the comments, though she tried to pretend otherwise. A voice called across the room with false cheer, "Hey, sweetheart, you look lonely. Need some company?" Laughter followed, rough and guttural. She stared harder into her glass, hoping the sound would pass over her like rain on a roof. But it didn't. The second voice came sharper, more insistent. "Don't be shy, darling. We don't bite. Not unless you ask us to." The table roared again. She flinched, her fingers tightening around the rim of her drink until her knuckles whitened. Rhonda watched from her corner, her expression calm but her eyes focused. She knew this moment well. It was the opening gambit, the test. Men like that always began with words, trying to measure how much fear they could pull from their chosen target. If she gave them nothing, sometimes they grew bored. But sometimes, too often, they took silence as defiance. Rhonda's hand rested lightly on the edge of her table. She didn't plan to move yet, but her body was ready. Years of discipline had trained her to hold still, to wait for the exact moment when intervention would carry the most weight. At the bar, the woman shifted uneasily. She glanced at the bartender, but he dropped his eyes before she could even form a plea for help. He knew better. He had lived this night before, in a dozen different variations, and he had learned his place. His silence stung her, but she could not blame him. Not really. Fear was a currency in this place, and everyone paid in their own way. One of the bikers rose from the table. He was stocky, with a thick beard and a grin that promised nothing good. His boots thudded against the wooden floorboards as he sauntered toward the bar. He leaned an elbow against the counter beside her, his presence cutting off her air. The smell of beer and smoke rolled off him in waves. He spoke low enough that only she could hear, though his friends leaned forward to catch her reaction. "Come on now, sweetheart. Don't be rude. You're making us feel unwelcome." His hand brushed the edge of her sleeve, deliberate in its casualness. She jerked her arm away, shaking her head. "Please, just leave me alone," she whispered. The words escaped more fragile than she intended, trembling in the air. He chuckled, turning his head so his friends could see the way she shrank away. Their laughter came again, harder, sharper, fueling his pride. He leaned closer. Don't be like that. We're just being friendly." His breath was hot against her cheek, and she recoiled, pressing her back against the bar, as though it could shield her. Rhonda exhaled slowly, her eyes narrowing. She had promised herself she would wait, but she also knew that the line between words and action was paper thin. She could see how the woman's shoulders trembled, how her eyes darted toward the door, and then back down again, calculating an escape she knew she couldn't make. Rhonda's pulse remained steady, but her muscles were ready, coiled like springs beneath her calm exterior. The leader of the bikers had not moved from his seat, but his eyes were locked on the scene. He watched his man lean closer, watched the woman recoil. His grin stretched wider, showing teeth. He enjoyed this part most, the anticipation, the performance. He tapped his beer bottle twice against the table, a signal his men knew well. Another biker stood, taller than the first, with a shaved head and a mean glint in his eyes. He walked over to flank the woman from the other side, effectively caging her between them. She froze, her breathing shallow. The first man laughed, looking back at the table. "She's shy, boys, real shy." His friend smirked and added, "Don't worry, we'll loosen her up." The chorus of approval from their table was loud enough to drown the jukebox for a moment. The young woman pressed her palms flat against the bar, as though bracing herself against the tide. The bartender's throat worked nervously as he glanced up, meeting her eyes for only an instant. He wanted to tell her to leave, to run, but the storm outside was as unforgiving as the men inside. And he knew that if she stood up now, they would only follow. He swallowed hard, looking down again, wiping the same spot on the counter until the wood gleamed beneath the rag. Rhonda pushed her plate aside. She leaned back in her chair, her gaze steady on the unfolding scene. She had not yet been noticed, not truly. To them, she was just another patron in the corner, another set of eyes too afraid to interfere. That anonymity was her advantage. She knew she would not have it for long, but for now it allowed her to choose her moment. The woman at the bar shook her head again, more desperately this time. "I said leave me alone." Her voice cracked on the last word, and the bikers roared with laughter. One of them leaned in closer, his breath hot and sour. "Oh, she's got some fire. I like that." He reached for her wrist, fingers closing around it with deliberate slowness, savoring the way her face twisted in fear. She struggled, but his grip was iron. The other man stepped closer, hemming her in completely. At their table, the rest of the gang was on their feet now, waiting, eager. They could smell the fear in the air, thick and cloying, and it spurred them on. This was the part of the night that always spiraled, the part that always ended with someone broken. The storm outside rattled the windows, the thunder echoing in time with their laughter. Rhonda's chair creaked softly as she shifted her weight forward. She knew the moment was coming. The line had not yet been crossed, but it was inches away. She studied the leader at the table. the way his eyes glittered with cruel satisfaction. He was waiting for the performance to peak, for the humiliation to become absolute before he gave the order that would unleash the rest. The woman tried again to pull free, her voice louder now, sharp with fear. "Let go of me!" The bar fell into a silence heavy as stone. Even the jukebox seemed to falter in that moment, the notes dying away into static. All eyes turned toward the bar, waiting to see what would come next. The biker tightened his grip, his smile curling into something darker. Now, that's no way to talk to friends. His thumb stroked across her wrist in mock affection. The other man chuckled, leaning close to whisper something crude in her ear. She gasped, twisting, but there was nowhere to go. Ronda rose from her chair. She moved with the quiet certainty of someone who had made her decision long before her body followed it. Her hood slid back fully, her face revealed in the dim light. No one at the biker's table recognized her, but the bartender's eyes widened faintly. He had seen her before, if not in person, then on a screen. He said nothing, but hope flickered in his chest where there had been only fear. The bikers had not yet noticed her approach. Their attention was locked on the woman at the bar, on the way her fear fed their pride. But the air in the room shifted, subtle at first, a new weight pressing down as Ronda closed the distance. The storm outside roared, but inside silence reigned. The kind of silence that comes when something inevitable has already begun. The young woman felt the grip on her wrist tighten and her heart hammered in her chest. She did not see Ronda yet, did not know that salvation was moving toward her. All she knew was the laughter in her ears and the heat of hands she could not escape. And then a voice cut through the tension, low and steady, calm but unyielding. "Let her go." The sound of it broke the moment like glass shattering. The moment Ronda's voice carried across the bar, the room itself seemed to tighten, as though every beam of wood and every pane of glass was straining to hear what would happen next. It was not loud, not a shout meant to dominate, but calm, deliberate, and certain, the kind of voice that slipped past laughter and cut straight into the spine. The biker who held the woman's wrist froze for a fraction of a second, his smile twitching as though he wasn't sure he had actually heard what he thought he heard. Slowly his head turned, his eyes narrowing, until they landed on the woman standing behind him. Ronda's hood was back, her face fully visible now, the line of her jaw sharp in the dim light, her eyes steady and unflinching. The woman at the bar looked up too, her tear-brimmed eyes catching sight of the stranger who had come to her side. She didn't recognize her at first, not in this setting, not through the haze of fear, but what she saw in those eyes was enough. Calm, strength, no hesitation. For the first time that night she felt a thread of relief, thin but real, slipping through the tight coil of her chest. The biker let out a short, derisive laugh, trying to recover his rhythm. "What's this? Another do-gooder? You want to play hero, lady?" His grip tightened on the victim's wrist, his knuckles white, the action deliberate, meant to show everyone that he was still in control. His friend, the one flanking from the other side, leaned closer, his smile wide and mocking. "She doesn't know what she's gotten herself into." The gang's table erupted in renewed laughter, emboldened by the performance. Their leader leaned back in his chair, one arm draped casually across the backrest, the scar on his cheek catching the dull light as his grin widened. He enjoyed this. He enjoyed watching someone step into the fire without realizing how hot it burned. He tapped his bottle again, twice, a rhythm of anticipation. Ronda didn't move closer yet. She let her words settle, let the room absorb them, let the silence after them hang heavy. Her gaze never wavered. She looked at the man's hand gripping the woman's wrist, then back into his eyes. "I said let her go." The repetition was quieter, softer even, but in that softness lay a blade. The biker's grin faltered for the briefest instant. Then he barked out a laugh too loud, too forced, covering the crack in his confidence. He yanked the woman's arm up, lifting her half off her stool, making her gasp in pain. "What are you going to do if I don't?" he sneered. The bar held its breath. Even the storm outside seemed to pause, its steady roar muffled by the tension pressing against every chest in the room. The woman whimpered, a sound that seemed to slice through the tension more sharply than anything else. It was the sound of humiliation, of fear dragged into the open for all to hear. The laughter from the bikers rolled over it, louder, more vicious, feeding on the cruelty of the moment. One of them at the table slammed his hand against the wood, calling out for their friend to pour the drink over her head. The others joined in, a chant of encouragement that grew louder and louder until the leader gave a nod. The biker holding her grinned, his eyes narrowing as he reached for a fresh pint. The golden liquid sloshed inside the glass as he raised it, the foam spilling over the edge, drops trailing down his hand. The woman shook her head, whispering, "No, no, please." But her voice was drowned out by their laughter. With deliberate cruelty, he tilted the glass, pouring the cold beer over her head. It cascaded down her hair, soaked into her blouse, dripping onto the floor in a puddle. Her gasp turned into a sob as she covered her face with her free hand, her humiliation complete. The gang howled with delight, their voices filling the bar, pounding against the walls. The leader threw his head back and laughed, the scar on his cheek twisting with the motion. To them, this was victory, the kind of moment they lived for. The woman sagged against the bar, her arms still trapped, her body trembling with shock and shame. But not everyone was laughing. Ronda's eyes had not moved from the scene, her expression unchanged but her body now leaning forward, every muscle alive with purpose. She stepped closer, her boots striking the wooden floor with a sound louder than the storm outside. The biker noticed, his grin faltering again as she drew near, her presence suddenly undeniable. He still clung to bravado, sneering at her, his words sharper now, almost desperate. "What? You want some too? Maybe I'll buy you a drink. Looks like you could use one." Ronda stopped beside the woman, her gaze dropping once more to the hand that gripped the victim's wrist. Slowly, deliberately, she raised her own hand and placed it on the biker's, her fingers light but firm. His eyes widened at the touch, startled by the calmness of it. She didn't yank, didn't pull, didn't twist. Not yet. She just looked into his eyes and said, with quiet steel, "Let her go. Now." The silence that followed was unbearable. The bikers at the table leaned forward, waiting for the explosion. The bartender froze, rag in hand, his mouth dry. The woman, soaked in beer and shame, blinked up at her protector, unable to believe what she was seeing. The biker tried to laugh again, but the sound cracked, the edges frayed. He yanked his hand back, more to break her gaze than out of choice, and shoved the woman away. She stumbled, catching herself on the edge of the bar, her breath ragged, his face twisted with anger, his pride wounded by the subtlety of her defiance. He shoved his chest out, stepping closer to Ronda, his voice rising. "You think you're tough? You think you can tell me what to do in my bar?" The gang cheered him on, their voices spurring him, demanding more. The leader leaned forward now, his grin sharp as a knife. This was what he had wanted all along, not just cruelty, but spectacle. The biker shoved Ronda's shoulder, testing her. She didn't budge. Her body absorbed the push like stone absorbs rain. Her eyes didn't blink, didn't shift. She simply stood, calm as a mountain. That calm unnerved him more than any shove could. He tried again, harder this time, his hand striking her arm. She remained still, her posture loose, her gaze steady. His bravado slipped further. The leader barked out, "Teach her a lesson," and the table erupted once more. The biker roared, his face twisted in mock fury, and grabbed a half-empty bottle from the bar. He swung it toward her shoulder, the movement wide and sloppy with drunken arrogance, meant to intimidate rather than harm. But before the glass could connect, Ronda moved. Her hand snapped up, catching his wrist mid-swing. In the same breath, she twisted sharply, guiding the bottle away as though she were redirecting nothing more than a child's toy. His grunt of surprise was swallowed by the sound of his own body hitting the floor a second later. With a fluid motion, she redirected his weight, pivoted, and sent him sprawling face first onto the boards. The bottle rolled harmlessly away, clinking against a chair leg. The room went silent. The laughter choked off in throats, the clamor of voices dead in an instant. Only the storm outside dared to make a sound, and even it seemed muted, less certain. The biker groaned, clutching his wrist, his face twisted in pain and confusion. He rolled onto his back, staring up at her with eyes wide, as though unable to believe what had just happened. Ronda didn't follow him down. She didn't loom over him or strike another blow. She simply turned her gaze back to the woman she had come to protect. With her free hand, she took a napkin from the bar and handed it to her, her voice softer now, steady. "You're all right. It's over." The woman blinked at her, tears mixing with the beer dripping from her hair. She took the napkin with trembling hands, her lips quivering around words she couldn't form. Gratitude, shock, relief, all tangled together and trapped in her throat. Behind them, the gang was frozen. Their leader's grin had faltered, the scar on his cheek tightening with tension. He stared at the stranger who had just dismantled one of his men with the ease of brushing away dust. His eyes narrowed, the fire of challenge sparking in them. He had wanted a show, but he had not expected it to turn against him. The air was charged now, every man in the room waiting, knowing this was no longer a game. The humiliation of the woman at the bar had shifted into something new, something sharper. The storm outside crashed against the windows, thunder rolling in the distance, echoing the storm that was about to break inside. Ronda stood steady, her posture calm, her gaze unwavering. She had waited for the moment when the line was crossed, and it had come. She had stepped into it without hesitation, and now the night was hers to shape. And for the first time, Malik, the leader of the bikers, realized that the stranger standing before him was not just another fool to be humiliated. She was something else entirely, something he had not planned for. The silence that followed was heavy, oppressive, filled with the kind of anticipation that grinds nerves into powder. The biker groaned on the floor, clutching his wrist, while the woman he had tormented sat trembling, still soaked from the humiliation he had poured over her. Every eye in the bar was fixed on the stranger, who had moved with such precision, who had intervened without a trace of hesitation. The storm outside rattled the windows as if applauding the sudden shift of power. Thunder rolling in low waves that seemed to underscore the change in the room. Ronda stood where she was, her stance unshaken, her gaze steady as stone. She had not raised her voice, had not needed to. Her calm was louder than any of the bikers' roars had been. It was the kind of calm that unsettled men who relied on fear and noise to dominate. She did not look at the gang's leader immediately. Instead, she turned her eyes toward the woman at the bar, offering her the assurance of her presence, anchoring her in the storm that now swirled inside the bar as much as outside. The woman clutched the napkin with trembling hands, her lips pressed tight as she fought back tears. The kindness in Ronda's brief glance told her what words could not. She was no longer alone. The spell broke with the scrape of a chair. The leader of the bikers rose, slow and deliberate, his scar catching the dim light as his grin curved into something crueler. Malik's height alone was enough to command attention. Broad-shouldered and heavy with muscle, his leather jacket creaking with every measured movement. He didn't rush forward, not yet. He enjoyed the anticipation too much. His eyes burned with a mixture of challenge and disdain as he finally fixed them on the woman who had so effortlessly disarmed his man. "You've got some nerve," he said, his voice low but carrying through the room. Each word seemed to strike against the silence, sharp and deliberate. "Walking in here, thinking you can embarrass my people." His men at the table murmured encouragement, their bravado returning now that their leader was on his feet. They leaned forward, ready, eager for him to show them the dominance they were used to seeing. Ronda's expression didn't change. Her eyes met his with a calm that unnerved him more than any insult could have. "I told him to let her go. He didn't. Now it's over." Her tone was simple, matter of fact, like someone pointing out the obvious. It carried no anger, no fire, only certainty. Malik tilted his head, his grin widening though it no longer reached his eyes. He stepped forward, each thud of his boots against the floor like a drum beat. He stopped only when he was close enough for the smell of beer and smoke on his breath to invade the space between them. He leaned in, lowering his voice to a growl meant for her ears alone. "You think it's over? You don't get to decide that. This is my bar, my rules." He shoved his foot against the fallen chair near her, kicking it aside so that it clattered against the bar and rattled the glasses behind it. The noise was meant to intimidate, but Ronda didn't flinch. The tension in the room coiled tighter. The rest of the gang began to rise from their seats. They spread out slightly, circling, their eyes gleaming with the hunger of men who believed their numbers gave them control. One of them, a tall man with a shaved head and a smirk, stepped forward, his fists already raised in a brawler's stance. "Boss, let me handle her," he called, eager for the fight. Malik didn't respond immediately, his eyes still locked on Ronda. Then he gave a single nod. The shaved-headed biker lunged. His punch came wide, sloppy but heavy, the kind of swing meant to smash through walls rather than land cleanly. Ronda moved like water. She slid to the side, her body rotating just enough to let the strike pass harmlessly. As his momentum carried him forward, she caught his arm, redirected his force, and pulled him into a throw that sent him sprawling onto the sticky floorboards with a crash that shook the glasses on the tables. The crowd of regulars gasped, the sound sharp and startled, before silence fell again. The biker groaned, clutching his shoulder as he rolled to his side. Ronda didn't even look down at him. Her eyes remained on Malik, her breathing steady, her stance loose and ready. Malik's grin faltered, replaced with something harder. He had seen enough bar fights in his life to know when someone wasn't just lucky. The way she moved was too clean, too efficient. She was no ordinary stranger. "You've made your point," Malik said, his voice growing darker. "But you don't walk into my house and leave without paying the price." He stepped closer, his size imposing, his presence heavy. He jabbed a finger toward her chest. "Stand up, face me." Ronda tilted her head slightly, the faintest hint of amusement in her expression. "I already am standing," she said quietly. It was not mockery, but the simplicity of it carried more weight than any insult could. The regulars at the far tables exchanged nervous glances, some hiding their smirks behind their drinks. Malik's face hardened. The tension snapped with another movement from his men. One of them, unable to stomach the quiet any longer, grabbed a bottle from the table and charged at her side. The swing was clumsy, more for show than precision, but before it could land, Ronda reacted. Her hand shot out, catching his wrist mid-swing. Her other hand pressed against his elbow, and with a sharp twist she redirected his motion and sent him face first into the floor beside his friend. The thud was louder this time, the air leaving his lungs in a single-pained gasp. The bar went still again, the storm outside the only sound. The gang shifted uneasily, their bravado thinning as realization seeped in. This was no ordinary woman, no unlucky patron who had stepped out of line. She was something else, someone who carried a mastery they didn't understand. Malik's jaw tightened. His pride burned hotter than his reason, and though caution whispered at the edges of his mind, anger shouted louder. He stepped closer still, his voice rising. "You don't know who you're dealing with." His hand shot out, shoving at her chair leg, trying to rattle her stance to provoke her. The chair scraped against the floor, but Ronda didn't stumble. She simply steadied the glass of water on the bar with her fingertips, preventing it from spilling, her eyes never leaving his. That simple act, that refusal to be moved, was more infuriating than any blow could have been. Malik snarled, his body tensing. Around them his men shifted, readying themselves, the air electric with the promise of violence. The regulars shrank back, clutching their drinks, their eyes wide, knowing the storm inside was about to break fully. And then Ronda rose. She did not scrape her chair loudly or shove it back with theatrics. She simply stood, her motion fluid, effortless. She stepped slightly away from the bar, her body angled loosely, her shoulders relaxed, her hands low. There was no show, no swagger, just readiness. The room held its breath. Malik squared his shoulders, towering over her, his fists tightening. He had expected fear, but what he saw in her eyes instead was composure, an ease that made his skin crawl. She wasn't just standing up to him, she was waiting for him, waiting, calm as the eye of a storm. The storm outside roared louder, thunder crashing in perfect time with the silence inside. In that pause, in that heartbeat, the inevitable became clear to everyone watching. This was no longer a barroom taunt, no longer a game of humiliation. It was a fight, and it was about to begin. The storm outside had become a drumbeat of fury, hammering against the roof and windows, as if nature itself demanded to witness what was about to unfold. The bar had fallen into that eerie stillness which comes just before chaos, when every person in the room knows the moment of collision can no longer be avoided. Ronda stood with effortless calm, her posture loose, her eyes steady, her body a coiled spring ready to release. Malik loomed in front of her, his shoulders rising and falling with each breath, his pride too wounded to retreat, his anger too sharp to be dulled by reason. His men shifted around the room, forming a loose circle, their boots creaking against the sticky wooden floor as they prepared themselves. The victim of their cruelty still sat at the bar, clutching the damp napkin in trembling hands, her eyes wide as she watched the stranger who had stepped into the storm on her behalf. Malik's lip curled in a sneer as he glanced at his crew. "Take her," he snapped, his voice cracking through the silence like a whip. It was the command they had been waiting for, the release of tension that allowed them to surge forward, emboldened by their numbers. 4 men moved at once, their chairs toppling backward, the noise of wood scraping across the floor, mixing with the crash of thunder outside. Their movements were rough, uncoordinated, more fury than strategy, but in their eyes shone the dangerous certainty that numbers alone would carry the fight. Ronda exhaled, her chest rising once in steady rhythm, and then she moved. The first man lunged with a wild swing, a heavy fist arcing toward her head. She dipped under it, the air of the strike brushing her cheek, and her shoulder twisted as she drove her elbow sharply into his ribs. The breath whooshed out of him in a choked gasp, his body folding as she pivoted and caught his arm. In one seamless motion, she threw him over her hip, his body slamming against the floorboards with a thud that shook the tables. The sound of impact silenced the jeering for a heartbeat, but the others were already closing in. The second came from her right, a broken pool cue in his hand, the jagged wood gleaming as he swung it toward her. She stepped forward instead of back, her forearm rising to meet his strike, angling just so that the weapon glanced harmlessly away. Her other hand seized his wrist, twisting, redirecting his momentum. The cue clattered from his hand as she lifted him off his feet with brutal efficiency, sending him crashing onto the same sticky floor, where his friend still groaned. The third man attempted to catch her from behind, his arms wrapping around her waist in a desperate bear hug. Ronda's body lowered, her knees bending, her hips shifting. With a precise hook of her leg and a sudden shift of weight, she broke his grip and sent him flipping over her shoulder, his back colliding with the edge of a table that groaned under the sudden force before collapsing into splinters. The room erupted in shouts, curses, and the sound of glasses toppling from tables. Patrons who had been frozen against the walls gasped, some ducking under tables, others too captivated to look away. The bartender clutched the counter, his rag forgotten, his eyes locked on the spectacle unfolding in the center of his bar. He had seen fights before, but never like this. This wasn't brawling, it wasn't chaos. It was controlled, precise, every movement executed with a clarity that bordered on artistry. Malik snarled, fury rising in his throat as he watched his men fall one by one. But before he could move himself, another of his crew hurled forward. This one swung wild with both fists, desperation overtaking sense. Ronda's body moved as if guided by instinct honed through years of combat. She sidestepped the clumsy barrage, her hands snapping forward to strike his jaw with the heel of her palm. The crack of bone-meeting force rang out, and the man's head snapped back. He staggered, dazed, and before he could recover, she seized his arm and twisted, sending him spinning into the jukebox. The old machine sputtered with static before letting out a distorted note as it shook under the impact, the man sliding down its side to the floor. The circle of bikers hesitated now. Their confidence wavered, their bravado dimmed. They looked to Malik for guidance, for assurance that the tide could still be turned. Malik's eyes burned hotter, the pride in him refusing to admit what was becoming obvious. "She's one woman," he barked, his voice loud enough to mask the doubt creeping in. "Put her down!" 2 more obeyed, their boots pounding as they lunged. Ronda faced them head-on, her body twisting into motion. The first raised his fist like a street brawler, throwing his weight into a heavy right hook. She ducked low, her body sliding under the punch, her legs snapping out in a sweeping arc. His feet were taken from under him, his body hitting the ground with a grunt. The second tried to grab her as she rose, his hands clawing for her shoulders, but she pivoted sharply, her elbow striking back into his gut. As he doubled forward, she caught his head and brought her knee up in one swift motion, sending him collapsing to the ground. The storm outside howled louder, lightning flashing against the windows, the thunder rolling so deeply it rattled glasses along the bar. Inside, the noise of bodies hitting wood and the gasp of onlookers created a symphony of chaos. The young woman who had been the target of the gang's cruelty clutched her napkin like a lifeline, her wide eyes darting between the fallen bikers and the woman standing like an immovable wall between her and them. Malik had seen enough. His fury had consumed him, his pride demanding action. He stepped forward at last, pushing past the tables, his bulk moving like a storm of its own. His fists clenched, his teeth bared. "You think you're strong?" he spat, his voice booming. "Let's see how strong you really are." He lunged, his punch tighter, more controlled than his men's, aimed with the precision of someone who had fought before. But Ronda was ready. She met his strike with her forearm, angling it so that his power slid harmlessly past. In the same instant, she shifted her hips, caught his wrist, and forced his balance off. Malik stumbled forward, his boots skidding on the wet floorboards, his knee buckling before he caught himself with a growl. His men shouted encouragement, trying to mask the unease gnawing at their edges. Malik straightened, his jaw clenched, and surged forward again, this time faster, his punches flying in a barrage. Ronda blocked, redirected, ducked and twisted, her movements fluid, her counters precise. Her fists snapped into his ribs once, twice, each strike sharp and efficient, not meant to break, but to remind him she was always a step ahead. Malik grunted, the pain winding him, but his anger pushed him on. He swung again, a heavy hook meant to end it. Ronda slipped inside his guard, her hands catching his arm, and with one seamless pivot of her hips, she threw him over her shoulder. The floor shook as he landed, the impact knocking glasses off the bar in a cascade of shattering sound. The bar erupted in shouts, half from the bikers, half from the patrons who could no longer stay silent in their awe. Malik rolled onto his side, coughing, his pride stung deeper than his body. He pushed himself up with a snarl, his eyes burning. Around him, his crew hovered uncertainly, some clutching bruised ribs, others frozen where they stood. The spectacle had turned, and every man in the room could feel it. The dominance they had relied on had shattered, replaced with something they had no answer for. Ronda stood steady, her breathing controlled, her eyes locked on Malik. She had dismantled his men one by one, her every movement an answer to their rage. The storm inside the bar mirrored the storm outside, both reaching their crescendo. Malik rose again, refusing to yield, his fists clenched tight, his jaw set. The fight was not over, not for him, not yet. He surged forward once more, his roar swallowed by the thunder outside, and the battle reached its peak. The storm outside continued to batter the bar, as though the heavens themselves had chosen to bear witness to the chaos within. The fight had reached its peak. Malik had thrown everything he had into breaking the stranger who had stood against him, and still she remained steady and unshaken. The last echo of his roar seemed to die into the thunder outside, leaving only the ragged breaths of men who had once believed themselves untouchable. The floor was littered with bodies groaning in pain, broken chairs and shattered glass glinting in the dim light. The jukebox sputtered back to life for a moment, letting out a warbling guitar riff before dying again into silence. Ronda stood in the center of it all, her chest rising and falling with the controlled rhythm of someone who had trained her body to withstand storms far greater than this. Her fists were lowered, her posture loose, not triumphant, not boastful, merely present. The young woman at the bar, her blouse still damp and clinging to her, stared at the figure who had stepped into her nightmare and turned it into something else entirely. She held the napkin in both hands like a lifeline. Her lips parted as though she wanted to speak, but could not find words large enough for the weight of the moment. Malik struggled back to his feet, swaying, his broad chest heaving, his fists clenching and unclenching, as though his body refused to obey the signals of his pride. He was battered, bruised, his eyes bloodshot with fury and disbelief. He had been knocked down more times in the last minutes than he could remember in his entire life. Each time he rose again, as though sheer willpower alone would bend the outcome of the night back into his favor. But now, as he stood before her once more, his body betrayed the truth. He was tired, not only in muscle, but in spirit. The room remained frozen, the regulars watching with wide eyes, waiting to see if he would try again. One of his men, blood seeping from a cut across his forehead, whispered hoarsely, "Boss, it's done." Another muttered something that might have been agreement, though no one dared to move. They all knew Malik's pride was larger than reason, larger than sense. But even pride had limits, and tonight those limits had been carved into the very floor of the rusted chain by the woman standing before him. Malik's lips twisted into something between a sneer and a grimace. His eyes met Ronda's one last time, searching for fear, searching for anything he could seize upon to justify another attempt. But there was nothing there, only calm. Calm that told him she was not merely holding her ground, she owned it. He drew in a breath, his chest swelling, and for an instant it seemed he might launch himself at her again. But his body betrayed him, his step faltered, and the anger in his eyes dimmed into something else. Recognition. He spat blood onto the floor, his voice low but audible enough to carry through the room. "You think this is over?" His words were more hollow than he wanted, more like a question than a promise. Ronda's answer was quiet, almost kind in its simplicity. "It could be, if you let it." The bar absorbed those words like scripture. They hung in the air, not as a threat but as an invitation, a choice. Everyone heard them. Everyone understood what they meant. Even Malik's men, who had followed him into every fight, every drunken rampage, felt the weight of that choice pressing down. The woman at the bar swallowed hard, her trembling subsiding just enough for her shoulders to ease, though her eyes never left the stranger who had saved her. For a moment Malik stood there, his chest heaving, his fists shaking, his mind torn between the ruin of his pride and the whisper of survival. Then slowly he lowered his hands. He staggered back a step, his eyes still locked on her, before turning slightly toward his men. "Get me out of here." His voice cracked with fatigue, stripped of the command it once carried. Two of his crew rushed to his side, catching him under the arms, guiding him toward the door. The rest followed, limping, clutching at their bruises, avoiding the gaze of the patrons who now stared at them with a mixture of awe and disdain. The door creaked open, letting in a gust of cold, wet air that carried the smell of asphalt and rain. Malik paused in the doorway, turning his head just enough to glance back into the room, his face twisted with something unreadable, defeat, perhaps, or the hollow echo of a man who no longer believed in his own legend. Then he disappeared into the night, the door slamming shut behind him with finality. The silence that followed was immense. It was the silence of a bar that had witnessed something it could not easily explain, something that would be told and retold in hushed voices long after the storm had passed. The bartender stood behind the counter, his rag still clutched in one hand, his mouth opening and closing without words. Then finally he slammed his palm against the counter and barked, "Hell yes!" The room erupted. Patrons who had hidden in fear now roared with approval, boots stomping against the floor, hands slapping the tables, voices raised in raw cheers. The two truckers by the door whistled, one raising his glass in salute. The middle-aged couple who had sat frozen near the jukebox clapped until their hands stung. Even the bartender, usually the embodiment of caution, leaned forward with eyes shining, nodding toward the stranger as though she had restored something he thought long gone from this place. Ronda didn't bask in it. She didn't raise her arms, didn't smile, didn't acknowledge the applause beyond the faintest twitch at the corner of her mouth. She simply turned back toward the woman at the bar. Her eyes softened as she reached out a hand, helping her to her feet. The woman stood shakily, her body trembling, her eyes glistening with tears. "Thank you," she whispered, the words breaking as they escaped. Ronda gave her hand a gentle squeeze, her voice low but steady. "You're safe now." She reached for a fresh napkin, offering it to her with the same calm efficiency she had shown throughout the night. There was no triumph in her tone, no condescension, only the quiet assurance of someone who had done what needed to be done. The woman clutched the napkin, nodding quickly, words failing her again. Her eyes followed Ronda's every movement, as though afraid she might vanish as suddenly as she had appeared. But Rhonda simply turned, collected her jacket from the back of her chair, and draped it over her shoulders. She paused only once more, her gaze sweeping the room, taking in the wide-eyed faces of the patrons. The stunned bartender, the woman still clutching her napkin. Her words, when they came, were simple. Never let them think you're alone. Then she moved toward the door. The cheering died into silence as she crossed the room, the patrons parting instinctively to give her space. The door creaked as she pushed it open, and the cold breath of the storm rushed in, wrapping around her like a cloak. For a moment she stood there, framed in the doorway, her silhouette outlined against the sheets of rain that blurred the highway beyond. Then she stepped out into the night, the door closing behind her with a soft thud that seemed far gentler than the slam that had marked Malik's departure. The storm swallowed her quickly, her figure disappearing into the curtain of rain. Inside, the bar slowly returned to life, though no one spoke above a whisper, as though loud voices might shatter the fragile sense of awe that lingered. The woman at the bar finally sat down again, her legs too weak to keep her standing. She pressed the napkin to her face, her tears flowing freely now, but they were no longer tears of helplessness. They were tears of release. The bartender poured her a fresh drink, setting it gently in front of her, without asking. His eyes flicked toward the door once more, then back to her. "You'll be all right," he said, more to himself than to her. Outside, the storm raged on, indifferent to the lessons learned inside. But those who had been there would not forget. They would remember the night a woman walked into the rusted chain and tore down an empire of fear with her bare hands. They would remember how calm could be stronger than rage, how precision could defeat numbers, how strength did not roar but spoke quietly, decisively. And the young woman who had sat trembling at the bar would remember most of all. She would remember the hand that helped her to her feet, the eyes that looked into hers and promised safety, the words that told her she was not alone. That night, in a storm both inside and out, she had learned that courage could walk into a room wearing the face of a stranger, and that sometimes one act of defiance was enough to change the balance of everything. The rusted chain would return to its usual rhythm in the days ahead. The bikers would lick their wounds and weigh their pride against the memory of defeat. Malik would brood in silence, haunted by the ease with which he had been broken. The patrons would drink again, though now their stories carried a new legend. But for all of them, the stormy night would never be forgotten. It would live in whispers, in half-smiles, in knowing looks exchanged across the bar. They would speak of the woman who had come and gone, who had turned humiliation into justice, fear into silence, chaos into calm. And beyond the rain, Rhonda walked on, her boots sinking into the wet gravel of the road. She did not look back. She never needed to. The storm followed her, but inside her the storm had already passed. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next unbelievable story. Click now to watch the next video. Trust me, you won't believe what happens there either. And if this one shocked you, share it with your friends. Let them see it too.